Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about Gandhi's theory and practice of nonviolence. Let's go ahead and get started. So Mahatma Gandhi lived from 1869 to 1948, and he is most well known for being the spiritual and political leader of India's independence movement. Independence was achieved largely through nonviolent revolution in 1947, and we should note that it's the independence of not only India, but India at the time also comprised of Pakistan. So what is nonviolence? Well, the term that Gandhi used for nonviolence is Ahimsa. Ahimsa is the source of the term nonviolence. Now, he did use the term nonviolence as well, but as a translation of this Sanskrit term. So Ahimsa is Sanskrit for nonviolence. This is the origin, and we can literally translate it as no harm or no intent to kill, do not strike or do not injure. But Ahimsa is more than that. It's an ethical virtue in many Eastern religions, including Gandhi's own religion of Hinduism, but many others, such as Jainism and Buddhism. So we think of, in Western cultures, we think of courage and honesty, common virtues that were taught from early childhood. Ahimsa in some cultures is one of those virtues that you're just aware of, that something you are taught from a very early age. And that's the case for Gandhi. And that's something he talked about at the beginning of our reading, that from a very early age, he was taught about nonviolence and what it meant, at least from the religious perspective of his mother. But he does admit that there is a problem with the term Ahimsa, but in the translation of nonviolence, that it seems to indicate that it means non plus violence, so no violence, and that's all that matters. So does that mean that running away or cowardice is nonviolence? Because, well, there's no inherent violence involved there. You're not hurting someone, you're not striking anybody. So is that what nonviolence is? Does that count as nonviolence? What about non-action to injustice? You see something terrible happening in your country or in your neighborhood or in front of you, and you don't do anything about it. Well, you're not the one doing that injustice per se, so does that count as nonviolence as well? The short answer is no. Both of those things to Gandhi do not count as nonviolence. But as a result, we have to think of a more robust definition of nonviolence than simply no violence. So what does nonviolence mean? Well, to Gandhi views nonviolence as having two forms to create the whole. So Gandhi views nonviolence as both a positive and negative moral law. It's very important when we talk about a positive and negative moral law, or what Gandhi says, the positive and negative form of nonviolence. He doesn't mean a positive as in good and negative as in bad. He means positive as in a positive moral law tells us things that we should do, the ways that we should act, where a negative moral law tells us things that we should refrain from. So think of the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments actually take the form of primarily as negative moral laws. They tell us a lot of thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. Whereas a positive moral law will tell us something that we should do, thou shalt do this. So what is the negative form of nonviolence? Well, that's this common notion that we have. Directly from the reading, Gandhi says in its negative form, it means not injuring any living being, whether body or mind. So here we see an extension of the original conventional view of nonviolence, of simply no violence, to beyond just physical violence, but also mental violence, and also into the realm of intention. He thinks that not only should you not harm other individuals, you should not intend harm on other individuals. You do not intend harm or hold ill will towards any living being. Now we should note for Gandhi, nonviolence equally applies to animals as to humans, and this is actually another common feature for Eastern traditions such as Hinduism and Buddhism, that animals are just automatically included into the moral community, whereas in Western traditions, it's not as common to do that. The negative form of nonviolence, or Ahimsa, for Gandhi, it's necessary. That is a part of nonviolence, but he calls it the lowest form of nonviolence. If we practice this form of nonviolence alone, we aren't being nonviolent per se, but unviolent. He sometimes calls this nonviolence of the weak. So going back to that question of whether cowardice can be nonviolent, he says, well, it can be if you're focusing on unviolence, if you're focusing on this negative form of Ahimsa. Once again, not that this form is bad on its own, it only can be bad if that's all you're focusing on. If we focus only on unviolence, it can lead to those problems that he discussed, the problems of mistaking cowardice as being nonviolent when he says it's actually the opposite of nonviolence. So how is it the opposite of nonviolence? Well, we have to think of this positive form of nonviolence. The positive moral law, he says, is that we have to do something. What's that thing that we have to do? Love, care for everybody. So in his own words, in its positive form, Ahimsa, or nonviolence, means the largest love, the greatest charity. In other words, universal love, care for every individual. You should have this desire to help others, to live a life of service. Gandhi claims that if I am a follower of Ahimsa, so if you're a follower of nonviolence, I must love my enemy. Now, you might have heard statements like this before. In fact, there's very similar quotations to this in the Bible. Jesus says, yeah, love your enemy, pray for those that persecute you. Gandhi was in full agreement to this, even though he was a Hindu. As a result, if we love our enemy, but we also love every individual, that means you're going to actively resist evil for the sake of others that would be harmed, but also for the person that would be doing the harming. It's better for you as an individual if you don't do terrible things. So for Gandhi, nonviolence is actually the summit of all virtues, that you have to perfect all the other virtues in order to be nonviolent in its perfect form. That you need to be honest, you need to be courageous. And that's why he thinks that cowardice is the opposite of nonviolence, that you can't be a nonviolent individual and run away from a fight. If you care for those individuals, you want to stop the terrible thing from happening for both the sake of the victims, but also for the person that would be enacting the violence themselves. By preventing them from that violence, of performing that violence, you're actually benefiting them. So true nonviolence then involves both the positive form and the negative form. This is what he calls nonviolence of the strong. That's, in other words, the negative form of nonviolence comes out of the positive form. If you truly care for all individuals, you're not going to want to harm them, no matter who they are. But you won't be okay just passively standing by and letting things happen. So this is an interesting thing from the reading. He talks about soldiers and how soldiers, that true soldiers, are nonviolent rather than violent. He thinks that it takes bravery not to strike back and instead to respond with love. He thinks in this process we can transform the situation, and the main goal is to change the heart of your enemy rather than, well, changing them their material into not being alive anymore. So a quotation from our reading, he says, a man cannot then practice ahimsa, or nonviolence, and be a coward at the same time. The practice of nonviolence calls forth the greatest courage. It is the most soldierly of a soldier's virtues. A soldier who needs the protection of even the stick is to that extent so much the less of a soldier. He is the true soldier who knows how to die and stand his ground in the midst of a hail of bullets. Later on in the reading, he talks about how a soldier can better protect people without the use of violence and having the courage to lay down arms and only fight with active love, non-resistance, and so on. So something that Gandhi admits to is many people respond to these ideas that he has and says, look, you're good in theory, but in practice, no one's ever able to do that. That not everybody can be Gandhi's, and not everybody can fight back nonviolently. That ultimately it's unattainable. What's interesting is that Gandhi agrees. He says nonviolence is unattainable, but he says that's the way moral laws work, that moral laws are ultimately guidelines that we should try to follow even if we can't practice them perfectly. So nonviolence is unattainable, but strive for it anyways. Gandhi, at the end of his life, after spending decades of his life trying to become perfectly nonviolent, still considers himself as lacking perfect nonviolence. So think of this, the character that most people in the world associate with nonviolence, that individual himself claimed that he wasn't perfectly nonviolent. Gandhi commonly compares nonviolence to the concept of a perfect line. He states that Euclid's straight line may not be capable of being drawn on a blackboard, but the impossibility of the task cannot permit to alter the definition. So the idea here is that ethics is hard. Being a good individual is hard, and you will never become a perfect individual. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't try, and that doesn't mean that you should then lower the goalposts then. Say, well, I can't be that good, so I'm going to just try to be this good. Well, what's right is right. And the fact that you aren't able to obtain it yet or ever doesn't mean that that moral law should change. So another quote by Gandhi here, he states, "We may never be strong enough to be entirely nonviolent in thought, word, and deed, but we must keep nonviolence as our goal and make strong progress towards it." So another thing that Gandhi claims about nonviolence is he thinks that nonviolence is a moral law that we should follow independent of the consequences, but he also thinks that it happens to have the best consequences too. That nonviolence is more effective than violence in the long run. Ahimsa, or nonviolence, strikes at the root of the problem, which is anger and hatred, whereas violence only causes those roots to grow deeper. Not only is nonviolent the right thing to do, it is the practical thing to do if we consider it the long-term good. That it might take longer, a nonviolent revolution might take longer, but ultimately you're transforming the relationships entirely instead of having those same relationships, just one person having their foot on the neck of another. And that's only going to work for as long as the other person is subdued. Eventually that violence will erupt again, eventually. So what is nonviolence in practice? So nonviolence, as we saw, necessitates action. It's not passively sitting by and letting terrible things happen. It's not running away from a fight. At times, it calls for direct nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience, but the real test is practicing nonviolence in our daily lives. And this is an interesting point about Gandhi. Many people see him as a political leader primarily. But Gandhi saw himself primarily as a moral philosopher, you could say. That he primarily thought he should be nonviolent on an individual basis, and he was more concerned with those individual actions that you take in your daily life. But it's because of this principle of nonviolence that brought him out to the public sphere. So how did Gandhi himself put nonviolence in action? Well, in many ways. We'll just go over a handful. One interesting way is vegetarianism. He thought to be nonviolent, you should care for all individuals, including animals. And you can live, in fact, he did, live a long life and healthy life without eating meat. And so because you care about animals, you don't want to see them suffer, well, you don't eat meat then. But he also compared this to humanity as well, in that if by eating simply, you spend less money, and you have more resources to help others. We'll come back to that point in just a moment. He also had this idea of Shanti Senas, or peace armies, that he thought you could successfully defend a nation by spending the same amount of resources that you spend to train violent armies. If you devoted those same resources to a nonviolent army, developing strategies and brigades and so on, you could, in his view, easily defend a country using nonviolent methods rather than violent ones. Satyagraha. So Satyagraha literally translates to soul or love force or holding on to truth. This is what we traditionally associate with nonviolence. So things like civil disobedience, they're this open and intentional violation of an unjust law. Things like those rallies and marches and boycotts. All of those political, nonviolent, resistant tactics, that's what Gandhi would call Satyagraha. A practitioner of Satyagraha, he called it Satyagrahi. Another interesting implication of the way that Gandhi put nonviolence into action is non-possession. So he actually believed that it was wrong to own more than you needed because there are other people that need those objects. He believed, a quote from him, at least that's attributed to him, is live simply so that others may simply live. He believed that because you care about individuals, you're not going to take more than you need. Instead, you're going to give your excess to others to save their lives. Another quote on these lines, he says, the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. Finally, another example here is his ashrams. These were kind of nonviolent communes. Wherever he lived later in his life, he would start these simple villages where everybody who lived there tried to live nonviolently in every action that throughout their day. And so that went from cultivating their food, what to do with their waste, how to treat their neighbors, how to treat thefts, and even how to treat animals and livestock. So these ashrams, these nonviolent communities, some of them still exist today that he started. So in summary, nonviolence demands both that we refrain from wishing or contribute to the harm of any living being. So it tells us not to be violent, right? But more importantly, it tells us that we not only love and wish well-being upon all living beings, but we act on that love. That nonviolence is an active force. That is, he says, it's the most active force in the world, in fact, if you're practicing nonviolence correctly. And finally, we should continually strive to become more nonviolent, even though perfect nonviolence is ultimately unattainable. So something perhaps you can explore is, well, imagine Gandhi is correct. Perhaps you disagree, but just for the sake of argument, if he is correct, how can we practice nonviolence to the extent that he asks us to? But of course, we also want you to think critically about these concepts. What does Gandhi have right? What does he have wrong? What are some potential arguments for and against his point of view? I look forward to reading your thoughts, comments, and critical evaluations in the future.